During the last months of Henry VIII's life, he'd come under influence of a clique of lords with reformist or Protestant sympathies who had effectively undermined the Catholic faction at court by engineering the downfall of the Howards, its leading members. When the king made his will on the 26th of December 1546, he left the government in the hands of a council of regency that comprised 16 entirely beloved executors, none of whom were accorded any precedence as Lord Protector or Regent. These men were to rule jointly in the young king's name until he came of age, and Edward was commanded by his father never to change, molest, trouble, or disquiet them. These executors were all men who had only recently been raised to high office, and the most prominent amongst them were the Earl of Hertford and John Dudley, Viscount Lisle, both of whom had won renown through their military victories in Scotland, and Archbishop Cranmer. All except 4 were committed to the concept of royal supremacy over the Church in England and to the Protestant faith. Henry VIII had been a great champion of the English Church against heresy, but even he discerned how the tide of opinion was turning. Already by 1540 the English Bible had replaced the Latin one in many churches. The monasteries had all been closed, their wealth confiscated, and their lands distributed amongst those lords who had supported Henry's reformation of the Church. And the king had chosen notable religious reformers to educate his younger children. Nevertheless, the religion of England was still officially Catholic. Mass was celebrated in Latin, celibacy enforced among the clergy, and those who rejected the doctrine of transubstantiation were still burned as heretics. Yet while the provisions in Henry's will paved the way for England to turn Protestant, his death removed the last brake on faction fights between the advocates of the opposing faiths, for only he had been strong enough to ensure that a certain cohesion was maintained, despite the deep political and religious divisions within the council. Archbishop Cranmer, for one, believed that the late king had meant to establish a Protestant government, and he and his fellow councillors were committed to carrying out his wishes, if only through self-interest, for all of them had profited as a result of Henry's religious policy. Hertford, of course, had no intention of sharing the government of the kingdom with his fellow executors. As the king's uncle, he felt he should enjoy no less a role than that of Lord Protector, and in this he was supported by Paget and others, not only through self-interest, but because it was felt that the council was too large to wield power effectively without a leader. Hertford's connections, his military reputation, and his commitment to the reformist cause made him a natural choice. Henry VIII's death was kept secret for 3 days. As Hertford rode with Edward VI towards London, the council met at the Tower, where on the 31st of January Paget persuaded his fellow executors to disregard the provisions of the late king's will and name Hertford Lord Protector of England and Governor of the king's person. By unanimous consent, they agreed. A public announcement of King Henry's death was then made, followed almost immediately by the proclamation of Edward VI as king. Edward rode into London with Hertford that same afternoon and was greeted by a deafening salute by cannon as he entered the Tower, where his councillors, headed by Cranmer, were waiting to pay him homage. Later that day, the boy signified his approval of Hertford's appointment by signing the commission authorising the Earl's appointment as Lord Protector. Edward Seymour was at that time around 40 years old, tall and dignified, with fair hair and a full beard. He had come to prominence after Henry VIII married his sister Jane in 1537, and thereafter his rise to power had been swift. Ambition drove him, and as well as being determined to succeed, he was convinced that he alone was right. This made him insensitive to the opinions and feelings of others, and high-handed in his manner of handling affairs. The Emperor Charles V's ambassador, Van der Delft, described him as a dry, sour, opinionated man. Nevertheless, he was also intelligent, hard-working, averse to cruelty, generous and well-intentioned, though his austere, stiff manner and his pomposity did not endear him to those around him. As a statesman and soldier, he had undoubted ability, and he enjoyed considerable popularity with the common people, although his record of service was indelibly marred by his greed and his rapacious self-interest.